My name is Cassandra, and I am 32 years old now. For the first half of my life, I was the resident ghost of Blackwood Manor, a silent gray footnote in the gilded story of my cousin Victoria. They called me her companion, a charitable title for an orphaned ward who served as a breathing shadow. But when Victoria, the radiant sun of their world, was stolen from the sky, a ransom note her only trace, I was the only one left who could read the secret constellations she'd scribbled in the dark. I never imagined that the silly, useless games we played as children, the coded language and hidden maps that earned me so many scornful looks from my aunt, would become the one and only key to her salvation. Before I dive into the story of how a forgotten girl and a cynical Bow Street runner unraveled a kidnapping that held all of London in its thrall, I'd love to know where you are all watching from today. Let me know in the comments down below. And if you've ever felt invisible or had your passions dismissed as worthless, please hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers here, make sure you subscribe to join this amazing community of people who understand that sometimes the quietest voices have the most important things to say. The air in Blackwood Manor always tasted of beeswax and roses, a cloying sweetness that was meant to signify wealth and ease, but for me, it was the scent of suffocation. My life was circumscribed by the needs and whims of the Blackwood family, who had taken me in after my parents, their distant relations, had been lost to a fever when I was 5. They had done their duty, a fact my aunt, Lady Blackwood, never failed to mention to her society friends with a martyred sigh. They fed me, clothed me, and housed me, but they never truly saw me. I was a duty fulfilled, a box ticked on a list of social obligations. My existence was a series of quiet services. I was the one who ensured Lord Blackwood's reading spectacles were always polished and precisely 2 inches from the edge of his mahogany desk. I was the one who knew that Lady Blackwood required her morning tea to be steeped for exactly 3 minutes, not a second more or less, a task too nuanced for the bustling kitchen staff. And I was the one who fetched and carried for my cousin Victoria, the true center of the Blackwood universe. Victoria was everything I was not. Where I was quiet, she was vibrant. Where my hair was the color of a mouse's back, hers was a cascade of spun gold. Her laughter echoed through the grand halls, a sound my aunt and uncle cherished like a symphony, while my own voice was rarely heard above a murmur. They adored her, knew her, celebrated her every trivial accomplishment with a fervor that was both dazzling and painful to watch. I remember one afternoon when we were children, perhaps 9 or 10 years old. Victoria had spent an hour dabbing watercolors onto a piece of paper, creating a misshapen, garish blue flower that looked more like a bruise. Lady Blackwood had it framed in gilt and hung it in the morning room. Such an artist, she had declared, beaming. My Victoria, a true prodigy. That same afternoon, I had finished a sampler I'd been working on for 6 months. It was a complex pattern of intertwining ivy, each leaf a perfect shade of green, each stitch so tiny it was almost invisible. I had pricked my fingers 100 times creating it. When I shyly presented it to my aunt, she glanced at it for a moment, her eyes distant. "Very nice, Cassandra," she'd said, her voice flat. "A useful skill for a girl in your position. Now be a dear and ask cook if Victoria's lemon cakes are ready." The sampler was folded and put away in a drawer, never to be seen again. It was a small thing, a quiet cruelty, but it was the architecture of my childhood. My efforts were useful, Victoria's were art. And yet, despite the chasm of their affections that separated us, Victoria and I had a world of our own. It was a world built in whispers, in the shadowy spaces the adults ignored, the dusty attic, the overgrown corners of the garden, the narrow servants' staircases. In these places, away from the suffocating polish and parental adoration, Victoria was different. The weight of being the perfect, beautiful daughter was heavy, and with me, she could set it down. It was in the attic, beneath a single round window that looked out over the moors, that we invented our language. We called it the language of whispers, a patois of flower symbolism we'd learned from a tattered botany book, a bit of pig Latin, and signs we'd invented ourselves. A primrose meant first love, but also be patient. An acorn, held in the left hand, meant I have a secret. Tapping a rhythm on a wall, the beat of a wood pigeon's call, meant meet me at the hiding place. Our hiding places were a geography of our own making. The dragon's tooth was a jagged shard of granite at the edge of the woods. The fairy circle was a small hidden glade where bluebells grew in a perfect ring. In the vast, intimidating library, our spot was a hollowed-out copy of a dreadfully boring book, a treatise on forgotten follies, where we would leave notes for each other. Victoria was the architect of this world, her imagination a brilliant flame in the gloom of my life, but I was its cartographer and its linguist. I remembered every symbol, every password, every secret path. It was a game to her, an escape. To me, it was the only place I felt I truly existed. It was in these secret places she would confide in me, her voice stripped of its public, spoiled cadence.
"Father wants me to marry Lord Ashworth," she'd whispered one evening, hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains of the drawing room. "He's 40 years old, Cassandra, and he smells of stale snuff. He looks at me like I'm a prize mare."
I saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the panic of a girl trapped in a gilded cage. She told me about Frederick, a poet she'd met in the village. He had no money, no title, no prospects, but he wrote her sonnets that made her eyes shine. He called her his Violet, for her eyes, he'd said. She would show me his letters, written on cheap paper with a watermark of a swan, and I would help her decipher the more complex lines of poetry. I was her confidante, her secret keeper, the one person who knew the girl beneath the porcelain doll facade. The family saw a beautiful, sometimes petulant daughter. I saw a girl desperate for a life of her own choosing. This shared world was the single thread of genuine connection I had, and I guarded it fiercely. The day Victoria disappeared began like any other. The sun streamed through the tall Palladian windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had arranged the morning papers for Lord Blackwood, and was on my way to see if Victoria was awake when I heard the scream. It was not a sound of fright, but of pure, unadulterated panic. It was my aunt. I ran towards her chambers, my heart hammering against my ribs. The door to Victoria's room was wide open. Her bed, with its canopy of silk and lace, was empty, the covers thrown back as if she had left in a hurry. A single window stood open, a soft breeze rustling the curtains. Lady Blackwood was standing in the middle of the room, a piece of paper clutched in her trembling hand, her face a mask of white terror. Lord Blackwood stood beside her, his usual blustering authority completely gone, replaced by a slack-jawed dread. "She's gone," Lady Blackwood whispered, the words ragged. "Someone has taken my baby." Chaos, swift and absolute, descended upon the manor. Staff scurried about, wringing their hands and speaking in hushed, frightened tones. Lord Blackwood bellowed orders that no one understood, his face purple with a mixture of rage and fear. My aunt simply collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. The piece of paper she had dropped lay on the floor. I picked it up. It was a ransom note, the words crudely cut from newspapers and pasted onto a sheet of plain stock. They demanded a staggering sum, a king's ransom for the safe return of their daughter. My blood ran cold, but as I looked at the note, something else caught my eye. Tucked inside the fold of the paper, almost falling out, was a single tiny pressed flower, a violet. Within the hour, the Bow Street runners had been summoned. The man who arrived was not what I expected. I had imagined someone brawny and officious. Instead, the man who strode into the grand hall of Blackwood Manor was lean and severe, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a mouth that looked as if it had never learned to smile. His name, he announced in a clipped, impatient voice, was Caelan Thorne. He moved with a kind of predatory stillness, his gaze sweeping over the opulent room and its hysterical occupants with an air of profound weariness, as if he had seen it all 1,000 times before. He listened to Lord Blackwood's sputtering threats and Lady Blackwood's tearful recollections of Victoria's beauty and social engagements. He absorbed their panic with a chilling lack of emotion. His eyes scanned the room, cataloging everything, and when they passed over me, standing silently by the door, it was with the same fleeting disinterest one might give a coat rack or a potted fern. I was part of the scenery, inanimate and irrelevant. "Did your daughter have any enemies?" Thorne asked, his voice cutting through Lady Blackwood's wails. "Any spurned suitors? Gambling debts?" "Certainly not." Lord Blackwood boomed, offended. "Victoria is beloved by all. This is the work of common brutes, envious of our station." Thorne's lip curled almost imperceptibly. "And her confidantes? Who did she trust? Who knew her secrets?" "Her dearest friends, of course," Lady Blackwood offered, rattling off a list of vapid society heiresses. "The daughters of the Duke of Clarendon, Lady Annalee." My heart sank. They knew nothing. They knew the public Victoria, the perfect doll they had created. They knew nothing of the girl who dreamed of poets and hated the smell of snuff. I took a hesitant step forward, my hands twisting the fabric of my gray dress. "My lady," I began, my voice barely a whisper. We had certain games, a language. Lady Blackwood's head snapped towards me, her grief-stricken face hardening into its familiar mask of irritation. Cassandra, this is no time for your fanciful notions. The runners are here. This is serious business. Be useful and fetch some fresh tea for Mr. Thorne. The dismissal was as swift and sharp as a slap. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, the shame of being put back in my place. I retreated, my words dying in my throat. I fetched the tea, my hands shaking slightly. As I placed the tray on the table, Thorne picked up the ransom note. He noticed the pressed violet that had fallen onto the polished wood. He nudged it with his finger. A sentimental touch, he muttered to himself, his tone drenched in cynicism. The kidnapper has a flair for the dramatic. My breath caught. It wasn't a sentimental touch. It wasn't dramatic flair. It was a message. In our language of whispers, the violet had two meanings. The simple one was watchfulness, a warning that she was being watched. But Frederick, the poet, had called her Violet. This was not from the kidnapper. This was from Victoria, and it was meant for me. Thorne was about to dismiss it, to sweep it aside as meaningless debris, and with it the only real lead they had. The family was useless, lost in their own performance of grief. The authorities saw only a flower. I was the only person on earth who could translate it. I watched Thorne, his cynical face a fortress of disbelief, and I knew I had to make him listen. The life of the only person who had ever truly shared her world with me depended on it. I had to find the courage to speak to the man who looked right through me and make him see. I waited for what felt like an eternity, hovering in the shadows of the hallway, while Thorne concluded his initial fruitless interview with the Blackwoods. He emerged from the drawing room looking more weary and more cynical than when he had entered, a small notebook in his hand and a deep frown etched between his brows. He clearly believed he was wasting his time with these hysterical aristocrats. This was my moment. As he strode towards the main entrance, I intercepted him, stepping out from the alcove where I had been hiding. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I expected. He stopped and looked down at me, his gray eyes appraising me with an expression of mild annoyance. "Yes, what is it? I'm quite busy, girl." Girl. The word was a casual dismissal, but I refused to be dismissed again. "It is about the flower," I said, my gaze steady. "The violet you found with the note." He let out a short, humorless huff of air. "What about it? It is a common wildflower. The kidnapper is likely a gardener or a romantic fool. It means nothing." "It means everything," I insisted, taking a step closer. The sheer audacity of my own actions surprised me. "It is not from the kidnapper. It is from Victoria. It is a message, for me." For the first time, a flicker of something other than boredom crossed his face. It was incredulity, mingled with suspicion. He studied me, his head tilted slightly. "A message? And how would you be the intended recipient of this floral correspondence?" The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to taste. "We have a language," I explained, the words feeling foolish and childish even as I said them. "A secret one, that we invented, of flowers and signs." Thorne's expression settled into one of deep skepticism. I could see the thoughts forming behind his eyes, a hysterical servant, an attention-seeking ward, a lonely girl lost in fantasy. He was ready to wave me away, to return to the real work of police procedure. "She called you girl," he stated flatly. "Lady Blackwood. If you are this Miss Victoria's cherished confidante, why does her own mother treat you like a scullery maid?" The question was a direct hit, and it stung. "Because that is all they see," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, but laced with a sudden, unfamiliar bitterness. "They see what they wish to see, but Victoria, she saw me. The violet can mean I am being watched, but it was also his name for her, the poet she loved." His eyebrows shot up. "Poet?" Her parents mentioned no poet. They were quite insistent she was to marry Lord Ashworth. "Exactly," I said, pressing my advantage. "They disapproved. They forbid her from seeing him. His name is Frederick." The violet was to get my attention, to tell me this involved him. Thorne was silent for a long moment, his gaze boring into me. He was a man who trusted facts, evidence, tangible things. I was presenting him with the ephemeral stuff of childhood games and secret romance, but the Blackwoods had given him nothing, and he knew it. He was a hunter with no trail to follow. I was, at the very least, a scent on the wind. "All right," he said finally, the word clipped. Let us say, for a moment, that I entertain this theory. What else does your secret language tell you? He was testing me, daring me to provide something more substantial. My mind raced. I visualized the ransom note, the crudely cut letters. My eyes had been so drawn to the flower, I hadn't properly looked for anything else. But now, thinking back, I remembered something. A tiny, almost imperceptible detail. The note, I said, my voice quickening with excitement. It demanded a king's ransom. On the paper, near the word king, there was a smudge of ink. It wasn't an accident. A smudge, he repeated, his voice flat with disbelief. It was deliberate, shaped like a bird's wing. In our code, a wing means fly or hurry, and king, that points to a place. The King's Head Tavern, on the east side of the city. It's a message. She's telling me Frederick has taken her there, and that we must hurry. Thorne stared at me, his cynical mask firmly in place, but I saw a new calculation in his eyes. What I was saying was fantastical, but it was also specific. It was a testable hypothesis, more than anything else he had. The King's Head is one of the foulest dens in this city, he said, more to himself than to me. Not the sort of place a poet would take a lady, even one he was abducting. Perhaps he is not the romantic she believed him to be, I countered. He made his decision. I will look into it, he said, turning to leave. You will remain here. Do not speak of this to anyone. If you are right, you could put her in greater danger. If you are wrong, you are a fool who is wasting my time. In either case, stay put. A surge of defiance, cold and clear, washed over me. For 18 years I had been told to stay put, to be quiet, to be useful by being invisible. Not this time. No, I said. He stopped dead and turned back, his expression thunderous. What did you say? I said no, I repeated, my voice shaking but firm. If there is another clue at this tavern, it will be in our language. You will see a discarded piece of rubbish, a random knot in a rope. You will see nothing. But I will see a message. You will fail without me. We stood there in the grand hall. A silent battle of wills waged between the cynical man of the world and the invisible girl from the shadows. He saw my plain gray dress, my trembling hands, my complete lack of experience in the brutal world he inhabited. But he also saw the unshakable certainty in my eyes. He saw the key. Get your cloak, he grumbled, turning away so I could not see the reluctant concession on his face. And stay directly behind me. If you get yourself killed, do not expect me to write a lengthy report. It was the closest thing to an agreement I was going to get. As I rushed to fetch my worn woolen cloak, a strange, exhilarating feeling coursed through me. For the first time in my life, I was not an afterthought. I was essential. The journey to the King's Head Tavern was a jarring descent into a part of London I had only ever read about in horrified newspaper accounts. The polished carriages and clean-swept streets of Mayfair gave way to a labyrinth of narrow, cobbled alleys that stank of gin and coal smoke. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with the shouts of dock workers and the grating screech of cartwheels. I sat beside Mr. Thorne in the grim, functional carriage he had procured, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, trying to appear calmer than I felt. He drove the horses himself, with a tense, focused energy, his eyes constantly scanning the crowds. He did not speak to me for the first part of the journey, and I was content with the silence. It gave me time to quiet the frantic beating of my heart. I had never been in such a place, surrounded by such raw, unvarnished life. It was terrifying, but it was also strangely invigorating. It was real in a way that the perfumed suffocation of Blackwood Manor was not. You are not what I expected, Thorne said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the street ahead. And what did you expect, sir? I asked, my voice small. Another hysterical female, he answered bluntly. Or a devious one, looking to insert herself into the drama for her own gain. I have seen both many times. I am not hysterical, I said quietly, and I have nothing to gain. That remains to be seen, he retorted, but the edge in his voice was slightly less sharp. Tell me more about this language of yours, and about your relationship with the girl. So I told him. As the carriage rattled over the uneven stones, I spoke of the rainy afternoons spent in the attic, of tracing the pictures in the old botany book. I described how we assigned meanings to everything, from the flight of a sparrow to the color of a ribbon. I told him how Victoria, for all her outward confidence, was terrified of her future. of the suffocating expectations placed upon her. I explained that our secret world, our games, were not just childish fancies, they were her only rebellion, her only space to be someone other than the perfect Miss Blackwood. I found myself speaking with a candor I had never used with anyone before. Perhaps it was the anonymity of the carriage, or the fact that Thorne listened with an unnerving, analytical stillness. He did not interrupt or judge. He just absorbed the information, filing it away. "She trusted you," he stated when I had finished. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "I believe I am the only one she did trust." He grunted, a non-committal sound. Trust is a dangerous commodity. It is often misplaced. We arrived at a street teeming with sailors and ragged-looking men. The King's Head Tavern was a squat, grimy building, its sign a peeling portrait of a forgotten monarch. Thorne pulled the carriage to a halt in a nearby alley. "Wait here," he commanded, his voice all business again. "Do not get out. Do not speak to anyone." This time, I obeyed. I watched as he entered the tavern, his tall, severe figure a stark contrast to the slouching patrons within. Through the grimy window, I could see him speaking to the publican, a brutish man with a face like a slab of raw meat. I saw the man shake his head, his expression surly and uncooperative. Thorne persisted, his posture calm but intimidating. After a few minutes he emerged, his expression grim. He had learned nothing. My heart sank. Had I been wrong? Had I brought us all this way on a flight of fancy, a misremembered smudge of ink? Thorne's gaze met mine, and I could see the "I told you so" forming in his mind. "They have seen no one of their description," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "No golden-haired girl, no poet, nothing." Desperation clawed at me. I scanned the area, my eyes darting everywhere, searching for something, anything. My gaze fell upon a wooden post just outside the tavern door used for tethering horses, and then I saw it. It was a small thing so insignificant that no one else would ever notice. A short piece of rough twine, tied around the post in a very particular knot. It was a series of interlocking loops that resembled a crawling serpent, the snake knot. "There," I breathed, pointing with a trembling finger. "The post. The string." Thorne followed my gaze, his brow furrowed. "It is a piece of string, Cassandra." He used my name for the first time, and the sound of it on his lips was strangely grounding. "No," I insisted, my voice gaining strength. "Look at the knot. It is our snake knot. It means danger or deception. And look at the way the loose end is pointing. It is pointing down that alleyway." He stared at the knot for a long, silent moment. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, the battle between his ingrained cynicism and the strange, compelling logic of my world. Without a word, he walked over to the post. He examined the knot, touching it with his forefinger. He looked down the dark, narrow alley it indicated. When he turned back to me, his expression was unreadable, but he had a pistol in his hand. "This time," he said, his voice low and serious, "you will not stay behind me. You will stay beside me, and you will do precisely as I say." The alley was a cramped, foul-smelling corridor between two leaning buildings. It was dark, even in the middle of the day, and the ground was slick with filth. Thorne moved with a silent, practiced grace, his pistol held ready. I followed as closely as I could, my cloak pulled tight around me, my senses on high alert. My fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, driving purpose. I was no longer a ghost, I was a hunter. The alley opened into a small, squalid courtyard, dominated by a single, dilapidated boarding house. A flickering gas lamp cast a sickly yellow light over its peeling paint and boarded-up windows. It felt wrong. It felt like a trap. "This is it," Thorne murmured, his eyes scanning the building. "If they are here, they will not be expecting us." He moved towards the door, signaling for me to stay back. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open a fraction of an inch and peered inside. After a moment, he pushed it fully open and entered, his pistol raised. I crept in behind him. The room was small and bare, containing only a rickety table and 2 chairs. It was empty. On the table there was a single sheet of paper. Thorne snatched it up, his eyes scanning the contents. His entire body stiffened, and he let out a curse under his breath that was sharp and vicious. "What is it?" I whispered. He handed me the note without a word. It was written in a neat, mocking script. You chase shadows, runner. The little bird is singing in a different cage. While you are playing with string, the price has gone up. Humiliation washed over me, hot and sickening. The snake knot, deception. It hadn't been a signpost. It had been a warning. I had led us into a dead end, a deliberate misdirection designed to waste time and mock us. I had failed. The confidence that had been blooming within me withered and died, leaving only the familiar bitter taste of inadequacy. Thorn crumpled the note in his fist, his face a mask of cold fury. "A child's game," he spat, the words aimed at me like daggers. I knew this was a fool's errand. You and your damned flowers and knots, you have played right into their hands. His anger was a physical blow. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. He was right. I was a fool, a naive girl who had mistaken her fantasies for reality, and now Victoria would pay the price. The long carriage ride back to Mayfair was a study in grim silence. Thorn was encased in a wall of furious disappointment, and I was trapped in a prison of my own making. The exhilarating sense of purpose was gone, replaced by a crushing weight of guilt. I had been so sure, so confident, and I had been wrong. Back in the library at Blackwood Manor, the silence was as thick as the dust on the high shelves. Lord and Lady Blackwood had retired to their rooms, sedated by the family physician. Thorn was pacing by the fire, his energy that of a caged wolf, no doubt composing a report in his head that would paint me as a deluded hysteric. I sat in a chair in the corner, feeling smaller and more invisible than ever before. I had failed. The thought repeated itself, a relentless drumbeat in my mind. The kidnappers were smarter than I was. They had used our own language against us. Deception. I should have seen it. The word echoed. Deception. What if the entire trail was a deception? What if the tavern, the knot, all of it was a lie built upon a single truth? My mind went back to the very beginning. The first clue, the violet. I had interpreted it as a signpost, a message about a place, or about Frederick's involvement. But what if its meaning was simpler, more direct? Frederick's nickname for Victoria was Violet. He didn't call her that in public, only in his letters. The flower wasn't a clue from Victoria to me. It was the kidnapper's signature, a taunt aimed at the family. But only someone who knew that intimate detail would use it. It had to be Frederick. I picked up the original ransom note which Thorn had left on the table. My hands trembled as I smoothed it out. I ignored the pasted words. I ignored the memory of the birdwing smudge. I looked at the paper itself. It was plain, but holding it up to the firelight, I saw it, a faint, almost invisible mark embedded in the fibers. A watermark, a swan. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was the same watermark that had been on all of Frederick's letters, the cheap stationery he used because it was all he could afford. My theory hadn't been completely wrong. It had just been incomplete. I had been so focused on our secret language of places and actions that I had missed the most obvious clue of all. The message wasn't just in the symbols, it was in the very fabric of the communication, and the phrase, "a king's ransom." Victoria had once told me, laughing, about a conversation she'd had with Frederick. He had been lamenting his poverty, his inability to offer her anything. "I am a penniless king," he had said, "ruling over a kingdom of ink and sorrow. A king's ransom." It wasn't about the amount of money. It was about him. Frederick was the king in question. The entire trail, the tavern, the snake knot, it was all a sophisticated lie, a game designed by a poet, a man who dealt in metaphor and misdirection. But he had made one mistake. He had used his own paper. I shot to my feet, the paper clutched in my hand. "Mr. Thorn!" He stopped pacing and turned to me, his expression wary and impatient. "I have no time for more theories, Cassandra. I must make my report. We are back to where we started. We have nothing." "We have everything," I cried, rushing towards him. I thrust the paper into his hand. "Look at it. Hold it to the light. The watermark. It's a swan." He did as I asked, his brow furrowed in concentration. He held the paper up to the fire, his sharp eyes examining the faint mark.
"I see it. What of it?"
"It is the stationery Frederick, the poet, uses," I explained, the words tumbling out in a rush. Victoria showed me his letters, and the phrase "a king's ransom." It's not about money, it's about him. He called himself a penniless king. Don't you see? The trail to the tavern was a lie, a piece of theater, but the note itself, the paper and the words, that's the truth. He wrote it. He has her. Thorn lowered the paper, his gaze fixed on my face. The impatience was gone. The anger was gone. His cynical mask, which had been so firmly in place, finally, truly, cracked. He was no longer looking at a foolish girl. He was looking at a partner. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, gleaming focus, the look of a predator who has finally caught the scent of his true prey. "You are certain," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," I replied, my voice ringing with a conviction that felt entirely new. He nodded slowly, a grim smile touching his lips for the very first time. It was not a pleasant sight, but it was a profoundly reassuring one. "A poet," he mused. "They are always so fond of their own cleverness. It is usually their undoing." He looked at me, his gray eyes alight with a newfound grudging respect. Where would this penniless king hold his court? My mind, now clear and sharp, sifted through months of Victoria's whispered confidences, through every detail she had shared about her secret suitor. Frederick was dramatic, romantic, and deeply self-pitying. He would not choose a common criminal's hideout. He would choose somewhere that fit his tragic narrative. "She told me once he lived in a garret," I said, the memory surfacing with perfect clarity. "She laughed about it, but she said it was terribly romantic. A garret overlooking the forgotten gods." Thorn frowned. "Forgotten gods? What does that mean?" "I asked her the same thing," I replied. "She said his window looked out over the back of St. Giles in the Fields. The church has those old, crumbling statues on the rear facade, saints and angels so weathered they look like pagan idols. He called them his forgotten gods." Thorn's grim smile widened. St. Giles, a rookery of the highest order, a place crawling with cut purses and desperate men. A poet would feel right at home. He was already moving towards the door, his purpose renewed. "Get your cloak. It seems our hunt is not over yet." There was no hesitation this time. We moved as a unit, a strange and unlikely partnership forged in cynicism and secret languages. As we stepped out into the night, the cool air a balm after the stuffy library, I felt the last vestiges of the invisible ward fall away. I knew where she was, and this time, I knew I was not wrong. The carriage ride to St. Giles was tense and silent. The city grew darker, more menacing. The gaslights seemed fewer and farther between, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. Thorn was a coiled spring of readiness beside me, his hand never straying far from the pistol tucked into his belt. I, on the other hand, felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. The fear was still there, a low thrum beneath the surface, but it was controlled, channeled into a singular focus. We found the tenement building easily enough. It was a tall, narrow structure, leaning against its neighbors as if for support, wedged into a lane directly behind the darkened mass of the church. The crumbling visages of the forgotten gods stared down at us from the church wall with blind stone eyes. "This is the place," Thorn said, his voice a low whisper. "He will be on the top floor, the garret." He looked at me, his face stark in the moonlight. "From this point on, you do exactly as I say, no arguments." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We entered the building, the stench of damp and decay immediately assaulting us. We climbed the rickety stairs, each creak and groan of the old wood sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. On the top landing, a thin line of yellow light seeped from beneath a single door. We could hear voices from within, angry and agitated. "Told you this was madness," one voice, rough and unfamiliar, snarled. "The moment they called in a runner, the game was over. We should have left her and run." "And leave with nothing," another voice, smoother and laced with panic, retorted. "It was Frederick. She is worth a fortune. Her father will pay. He has to. He'll see us hang, is what he'll do. She's seen my face." Thorn put a finger to his lips, then pointed to the door. He mouthed the words, "On my count." He was planning to storm the room, to rely on surprise and force. But as I shifted my position, I caught a glimpse through a crack in the warped wooden door. I could see a sliver of the room inside. I saw Victoria. She was tied to a sturdy wooden chair, a gag in her mouth. Her golden hair was disheveled, and her beautiful dress was torn at the shoulder. But her eyes, her violet eyes, were blazing with a furious fire. She was not a damsel in distress. She was a captive queen, radiating contempt for her captors. Seeing her so defiant and alive solidified my resolve. A frontal assault was too risky. The other man, the thuggish one, was standing near her. If he was desperate, he might harm her before Thorn could stop him. There had to be another way. I looked at the wall beside the door. It was thin, plaster over lath. I remembered the rhythms, the codes we had used for years to communicate between our bedroom walls at the manor. I reached down, my fingers closing around a loose piece of fallen plaster from the floor, a small, hard stone. Thorn was counting down on his fingers. 3, 2. I ignored him. I pressed my ear to the wall to get the location right. Then I began to tap. It was a soft, distinct rhythm, barely audible. Tap, 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 tap. The call of the nightingale. In our language, it meant sing, and sing meant create a diversion. Thorn froze, his hand in the air, his eyes flashing with fury at my insubordination. He opened his mouth to hiss at me, but then, from inside the room, we heard a muffled sound from Victoria. Her eyes, which had been fixed on her captors, darted towards the wall. She had heard me. She understood. Her body began to shake. She made a series of choked, sobbing sounds, her shoulders heaving. Frederick and his accomplice turned towards her. "What now?" the thug growled. Then Victoria threw her head back and began to scream. But it was not a scream of fear. It was a sound of pure, incandescent rage, muffled but still powerful through the gag. She kicked her legs, drumming her heels against the floorboards. With a violent surge, she threw her weight sideways, toppling the heavy chair she was tied to with a tremendous crash. The diversion was total. Frederick and the other man rushed towards her, trying to right the chair, to silence her. "Get her quiet, you fool," Frederick yelled. "Now." Thorn breathed, the anger in his eyes replaced by a look of predatory glee. He hit the door with his shoulder. The flimsy lock splintered, and the door flew open. He was inside in a flash. The thug, caught completely off guard, looked up just in time to receive the butt of Thorn's pistol to his jaw. He went down in a heap. Frederick spun around, his poet's face pale with terror. He grabbed a knife from the table and lunged for the still thrashing Victoria, yanking her upright by her hair and pressing the blade to her throat. "Stay back," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I'll kill her. I swear I will." Thorn froze, his own pistol leveled. We were at a standoff. The romantic poet was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. "Let her go, Frederick," Thorn said, his voice deceptively calm. "There is nowhere for you to run." "I love her," Frederick cried, spittle flying from his lips. "You don't understand. Her family, they were going to marry her to an old man. This was the only way." He was losing control, his grip on the knife tightening. I knew I had to do something. I took a step forward, into the room, past Thorn's restraining arm. "Cassandra." "No," Thorn warned. I ignored him. I looked past the knife, past the crazed man holding it, and met Victoria's eyes. I began to speak, my voice quiet but clear in the tense room, using the language only she and I would understand. "The rose is beautiful, Frederick," I said, my words seemingly directed at him, "but its thorns will always hurt you." Victoria's eyes widened slightly. "Rose for love, thorns for pain. Love is painful. You do not understand what it is to have oaken strength," I continued. Victoria's jaw tightened. "Oak for strength. Be strong. But remember this," I finished, my gaze locked with hers. "The ivy always finds a way to climb. Ivy, for escape. Find your escape." It was a conversation held in plain sight, yet utterly secret. A lifetime of shared whispers culminated in this one moment. I saw the understanding flash in her eyes, a spark of the fierce girl who used to plan mock battles in the garden. For a split second, her body went limp, as if in surrender. Frederick, sensing victory, loosened his grip fractionally, a smug look on his face. It was the last mistake he would ever make. In one explosive movement, Victoria drove the heel of her boot down onto his instep with all her force. As he yelped in pain and surprise, she threw her head back, smashing the back of her skull into his nose with a sickening crunch. His grip on her vanished as he staggered backward, clutching his face. That was all the opening Thorn needed. He moved like lightning, closing the distance, and a single, precise strike to Frederick's wrist sent the knife clattering to the floor. The poet crumpled, sobbing, his romantic escape ending in a pathetic heap on the filthy floorboards. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of heavy breathing. Victoria stood in the middle of the room, disheveled and bruised, but utterly magnificent. She pulled the gag from her mouth and took a deep, shuddering breath. Thorne was busy securing the two men, but Victoria didn't look at him. She didn't look at her defeated captors. Her eyes found mine across the room. 1,000 emotions passed between us in that one look. Relief, gratitude. A shared history of secrets finally brought into the light. Tears began to stream down her face, washing away the grime and the fear. And then she spoke, her voice hoarse. It was a single word, from our oldest, most secret vocabulary, a word we had invented when we were 6 years old and had sworn never to say in front of anyone else. Sestra, she whispered. Sister. In our world, it also meant savior. The return to Blackwood Manor was a surreal affair. Victoria sat beside me in the carriage, wrapped in Thorne's heavy coat, her hand gripping mine with a strength that was both desperate and reassuring. Thorne sat opposite, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of professional satisfaction and something softer, something that looked almost like wonder. We swept through the grand entrance hall to a scene of controlled chaos. Lord and Lady Blackwood, having been alerted by a runner sent ahead, were waiting. The moment they saw Victoria, they descended upon her like a tidal wave. My darling, my precious girl, Lady Blackwood cried, smothering her in a perfumed embrace, her fingers probing for injuries. Are you hurt? What did those monsters do to you?
We shall see them hang, Lord Blackwood bellowed, his face red with restored indignation. I'll spend every penny I have to see them rot in Newgate.
They fussed and fluttered around Victoria, pulling her towards the drawing room, their relief so all-consuming that they did not so much as glance at me or Mr. Thorne. We were, once again, invisible, the hired help and the forgotten ward who had fulfilled their functions. But then something remarkable happened. Victoria stopped. She gently but firmly pushed her mother's hands away. Stop, she said, her voice quiet but carrying an authority I had never heard from her before. Just stop. Her parents froze, startled by her tone. I am fine, she continued, her gaze sweeping over their frantic faces. But I wouldn't be, if it weren't for Cassandra. She turned, her beautiful bruised face full of a fierce and unfamiliar loyalty, and looked directly at me. She saved me. When you were all panicking and giving useless information, she was the only one who was listening, the only one smart enough to understand. She then turned her gaze to her father. And none of this would have happened if you had ever listened to me, if you had treated me as a daughter instead of a porcelain doll to be sold to the highest bidder. The silence in the hall was absolute. Lord and Lady Blackwood stared at their daughter as if seeing her for the first time. Mr. Thorne cleared his throat, stepping forward into the suddenly charged atmosphere. My lord, my lady, he said, his voice crisp and official, your daughter is safe. The two men responsible are in custody and will be brought to justice. He then opened his notebook. For the official record, I must state that the successful resolution of this case is due in large part, indeed almost entirely, to the assistance of Miss Cassandra. He looked directly at my aunt and uncle, his gray eyes cold and unflinching. Her intimate knowledge of Miss Blackwood's habits and her unique methods of communication were the only things that allowed us to cut through the deceptions laid by the kidnappers. Her intelligence and her courage under pressure were exemplary. You are exceptionally fortunate to have her in your household. Public vindication. It was a strange, hollow feeling. I watched my aunt and uncle absorb Thorne's words, their expression shifting from shock to confusion, and finally to a kind of awkward, public shame. They were being told by an agent of the law that the gray mouse they kept in their house was, in fact, the hero of the hour. Well, Lady Blackwood stammered, her hand fluttering at her throat. Yes, of course. We are most grateful, Cassandra, truly. Her words were stilted, the gratitude of foreign language on her tongue. It was not a change of heart. It was the frantic effort of a society woman, realizing she had made a terrible social miscalculation. It was almost comical. Later that evening, after the physician had seen to Victoria and the house had settled into a semblance of exhausted calm, she and I sat together in her room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I am so sorry, Cassandra, she said softly, her eyes filled with a deep, genuine remorse. For everything, for every time I let them dismiss you, for every time I took you for granted. She reached out and took my hand. Our secret world. For me it was always a game, a way to escape. I never realized that for you, it was the only world you had. It was our world, I corrected her gently. And it was real. It saved you. You saved me, she said firmly. You always saw me, Cassandra, even when I was too selfish to see you. In that moment, the last vestiges of the old dynamic between us crumbled away. We were no longer the princess and the servant, the sun and the shadow. We were equals. We were sisters. The next morning, Mr. Thorne came to say his goodbyes. He found me in the library, replacing the hollowed-out copy of a treatise on forgotten follies on its shelf. All tidied up, he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. A good librarian always reshelves her books, I replied with a small smile. He stood there for a moment, his hat in his hands, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. I have filed my final report, he said. Your role has been adequately documented. He paused. I have been a Bow Street runner for 15 years, Miss Cassandra. I have worked with all manner of men, constables, informants, magistrates, but I can honestly say I have never had a partner quite like you. My heart gave a little flutter at the word partner. The useless knowledge you possess, he went on, a real, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. The ability to see the patterns others miss. It is more valuable than all the police manuals in London. He put on his hat. Should you ever decide you require a change of profession, one with perhaps a little more intellectual stimulation than fetching tea, you know where to find me. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked away, leaving the offer hanging in the quiet, book-dusted air. It was not a promise of a job, but it was something far more valuable. It was a door, opened just a crack, into a world I had never imagined I could enter. A world where I would not be invisible. The days that followed Victoria's rescue were strange and unsettling. The entire dynamic of Blackwood Manor had been fractured, and the Blackwoods, in their clumsy way, tried to glue the pieces back together all wrong. They attempted to shower me with a kind of retroactive affection that was as awkward as it was transparently guilt-ridden. Lady Blackwood insisted I take my meals with them in the main dining room, where she would make painfully stilted conversation, asking about my day as if she had the slightest interest. Lord Blackwood offered me a larger allowance, a token of their gratitude, which felt more like a payment for services rendered than a gesture of familial warmth. They wanted to absorb me into their world, to smooth over the uncomfortable truth that they had been blind and foolish. They were trying to rewrite the story, turning the forgotten ward into a cherished niece overnight. But it was too late. I had looked through the door Mr. Thorne had opened, and I could not unsee the world beyond the suffocating comfort of the manor walls. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer craved a seat at their table. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their validation, and now that it was being freely offered, I discovered I had no use for it. My worth was not something they could bestow upon me with a bigger bedroom or a heavier purse. I had forged it myself, in the dark alleys of St. Giles, with a language of whispers and a core of strength I never knew I possessed. I made my decision. A week after the kidnapping, I found Victoria in the garden, sitting on the stone bench by the rose bushes. I told her I was leaving. She wasn't surprised. She looked at me, her eyes full of a sad understanding. "Where will you go?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "London first. Mr. Thorne, he suggested I might find work more suited to my particular skills. A consulting detective," she said, a smile gracing her lips. "I like the sound of that. You'll be brilliant." She sighed. "They won't understand, you know. Mother and father. They'll see it as a rejection, an act of ingratitude." "Perhaps," I said. "But my life is not about their understanding anymore." Her support was my shield. She helped me pack my few belongings not in secret, but in the open. She gave me a heavy purse of her own money, pressing it into my hand and refusing to take it back. "This is not charity," she said fiercely. "It's an investment in my sister's future." The day I left, Lord and Lady Blackwood stood awkwardly in the grand hall. They made one last desperate attempt to make me stay, offering me the official title of Warden of the Estate Library, a sinecure designed to keep me contained and accounted for. I politely refused. The look on their faces was one of profound, almost comical bewilderment. They could not comprehend why anyone would choose an uncertain, dangerous world over the gilded cage they offered. They simply did not have the imagination for it. As the carriage pulled away from Blackwood Manor, I looked back at the grand facade. Victoria stood on the steps, waving, a solitary figure of support. She was still a part of that world, but she was no longer its prisoner. We had saved each other. The next few years were a whirlwind. I did find Mr. Thorne. I did not become a runner, that was a man's world, and I had no desire for a uniform, but I became his secret weapon. I opened a small office in a respectable part of Bloomsbury, offering my services as a private consultant. People came to me with puzzles, disputed wills with coded language, lost heirlooms with cryptic clues tied to their location, anonymous threats written in cipher. My mind, which had spent years memorizing the secret geography of a child's game, proved to be perfectly suited to navigating the labyrinthine secrets of the adult world. I earned a reputation in certain circles as the woman who could see what others missed. I was no longer invisible. I was sought after. I received a letter from Victoria about 2 years after I left. She had successfully resisted all her parents' attempts to marry her off, and had used her considerable social influence to establish a school for orphaned girls in the village. She was teaching them not just needlework and etiquette, but botany and mathematics. She was giving them the tools to build worlds of their own. The letter was written on fine, expensive stationery, but it was filled with our old, familiar code, a mix of flower names and nonsensical words that would look like madness to anyone else. To me, it was the beautiful, clear voice of my sister. Looking back now, I see the profound irony of it all. The very things that had marked me as strange and useless in my youth, my quiet observation, my memory for trivial details, my love for a language no one else understood, became the cornerstones of my life and my success. The world of Blackwood Manor, which had tried so hard to define me by my limitations, had inadvertently given me my greatest strengths. Being underestimated, being overlooked, it turned out to be the most powerful advantage I ever could have wished for. It gave me the freedom to see the world not as it was supposed to be, but as it truly was. It allowed me to listen to the whispers, to read the clues hidden in plain sight, and ultimately, to find not only a lost girl, but myself. I'd love to read about your own experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had a skill or a passion that others dismissed, only for it to become your greatest strength? Sharing our stories helps us all feel a little less alone. Please don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories about finding your own power in unexpected places. Thank you so much for joining me and for listening to my journey. Remember that your true value is not determined by those who overlook you, but by the unique and wonderful language of your own soul.